Church, thank you so much for your generosity. We have 4 ways to give. You can give through our website. You can give through an envelope at the back of the sanctuary. You can text to give. And you can absolutely use our app to give. It's through your giving that we're able to support our outreach partners such as Streetside Showers, Bring the Light Ministries, or our food pantry here in Anna.
How do you get the app? You text the letters GPFC APP to the number 469-551-5353. There's so many things you can do in the app. One of the things is join a team. And can we encourage you to please go out there and join a team? There's hospitality, there's audio, there's kids ministry. There's so many things you can be a part of. So make sure and join a team today.
Thank you so much.
God bless.
Hey, Grace Point Family Church, thank you for joining our online service today. We have a great gift that we want to put in your hands. We want to email you how to access Right Now Media. It's a Christian online streaming service that you don't want to miss out on. So you can get that by texting the word welcome to
469-551-5353.
Yes. So we look forward to connecting with you. And right now, we're going to join the service live.
We'll meet right here with all of our friends. And also, thank you for your generosity. We have 4 ways to give. You guys are probably like, what order is she going in? So here we've got 4 ways to give. You can give online. You can text 469-551-5353. And you can also give in person in the back and also on the app. And now, Pastor Leif's going to come up here and tell us what's going on next.
Whoa. I hope you came this morning with a sense of expectation. Yes. And before we get to that, I want to say that sometimes we need to stop and recognize God's doing miracles in our midst. Octavia, you were standing in worship. We have been praying and believing for Octavia's complete healing, and today she was standing on her own. She walked into the coffee shop this week for the women's Bible study with the cane instead of the wheelchair. I'm telling you, God is on the move. And at the same time, I'm looking at Brad Miller, who is somewhere around here, all the way over to the left. I'm telling you, the stories that God has done in this house of the miraculous healings, and we don't ever want to miss an opportunity to give God some glory. What God did this week in Octavia is the beginning, not the end. Philippians 1:6, he is faithful to bring to completion those things he begins. Our God has begun a good work in her, and he's strengthening her bones, he's strengthening her muscles, he's relieving her pain. And at the same time, we have the opportunity to say, God, if you've done it for Octavia, if you've done it for Brad, if you've done it for the other stories in the room, Mike Hayes on the second row who is battling, and we are standing and praying and agreeing in Jesus' name, the same God who was faithful in the Old Testament is still faithful in the New Testament. The same God who did miracles then does miracles today. Our God is faithful and true, and we can trust him. And he is not done. He's not done in your story. He's not done in your story. He's only just begun the physical healing in your story. Now there's so much more he's going to do because of what he's worked into you. When God does a miracle in us, it's not just for us. It's God, now what do you want to do through me because of what you equipped me in? So God's going to do so much more in Brad's story, but Brad's story is the beginning of Octavia's story, is the beginning of Mike's story, and our God is faithful and true in all of it. We never miss an opportunity to give him praise. So I want to say this morning that I had the opportunity a couple of months ago. I may be flattering myself when I say that I'm at a kindred spirit. So I'll just say it anyway. I'm just going to claim it like it's true. So God introduced and brought into my life a kindred spirit, and I met Matt Davis at, of all things, a Torah blessing ceremony. And as we began to connect and talk, we have been home now from Israel for about a year and a couple of months. And as we were sharing about our experience in Israel, and he began to get emotional as I was talking about my experience on the Sea of Galilee, and I began to get emotional just in hearing what God is still doing in Jewish ministries and Jewish Road, the Jewish Road ministry today. He began to knit our hearts together. We've had lots of phone conversations, and you've heard from Matt Davis already. You just didn't know it was Matt Davis you were hearing from because I've been learning. There are some people, you feel like, okay, I've been in the Word all my life. I know the Word, and then you feel like you meet somebody who makes you feel like a toddler. So my friend Matt Davis is coming today, And I don't want to oversell, but you better buckle up. I hope you found some running shoes. I hope you're ready for what's coming next. Matt brought his dad, Ron. So it was good, and now it's gooder. I hope you're ready. Today's going to be an amazing day. I heard in first service what they're going to share, so I have a head start on y'all, but I'm telling you, we're growing this morning. We always believe as we come into this place together as a church family, for the purposes of receiving a word from the Lord, we always are changed from the inside out, and none of us leaves the same as we came. So I want you to attach your faith to what you're going to hear. I want you to open your hearts and receive it, and I promise you at the end, if you're not jumping and shouting, you're missing it. You missed something in there. Ask me, and I'll tell you what you missed afterwards. So let me just tell you, it's going to be good. Would you please get on your feet and welcome my dear friend, Matt, and his amazing dad.
There we go, and you may be seated. Thank you for coming and being part of this. We are excited. There's something on the move in this place called Anna, Texas. We had no idea. This is lovely. My name is Matt Davis. This is my dad.
Hey, I'm Ron Davis.
There you go.
Doesn't work out there.
Yeah. It has to stay attached. Actually,
It's
there's
hard
one.
to be Jewish and not talk with your hands.
Yeah, we always need our hands. There's one time where he needed his hands so much he actually put the microphone in his pocket and then just talked like that all over the place. It's really fun. Well, hey, we are California refugees who made our way to the promised land. Not the land flowing with milk and honey, but horses and bourbon. We live in Lexington, Kentucky. Not bad, right? So it's great, but this is the other promised land, and it's amazing. The slide that we had before, it said, welcome home. We feel welcomed here. You guys have just laid out the red carpet for us, and we feel this is home. This is beautiful. But what's interesting is today, the title of our message literally is, this is not your home. And what do we want to do? What we're going to tell you, this is how they tell you when you go to seminary. They say, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. We just want you to hear that God has put on our hearts. We want to remind the church that this place, this earth is not our home, that God is about to do something, and that we need to come with hearts of expectation. So let's give you a taste of who we are. If we don't look like it, we're Jewish. If we maybe give you the profile, there we go. Oh, now I see it. That's perfect. That's great. But we're not just Jewish. We're Jews who believe in Jesus. There are 15 million Jews in the world today, which actually gets us back to the point that the Jewish population was just before World War II, when we lost 6 million Jews. So 80 years later, we're back to that population. But of all of the Jews that are in the world, there are now finally more Jews in Israel than anywhere else in the world. Before that, it was in the other Jewish part of the world called New York.
That's where I was born.
Yeah, he's a Brooklyn baby here. And so what's interesting, though, of all of the 15 million Jewish people on earth, there are 200,000 that believe in Jesus, which is a very small population. Go back 100 years ago, there were only 1,000 Jews who believed in Jesus. So even though we're less than 1% right now, God is on the move and God is doing something. And so we've been raised up in this time for this generation to be able to tell this story that God is calling his people back. And we started a ministry a couple years ago. We've been in ministry. We've been doing things. I was a pastor at a church in California. God rescued us out of that. My dad has been a missionary with a ministry called Chosen People Ministries based out of Manhattan. But we started something new because we felt like God was calling us to do something. And how we describe who we are, what we are, we just had this sense-making device, this story that helped. And we said all of this is like a 2-act play. Is that right?
Yeah. This is how we explain ourselves everywhere we go. But it's as if all the Jewish people in the world bought tickets to this 2-act play. And they went in, they saw the first act, they thought it was great, loved it. Went out at intermission, went to the lobby, got a drink, and went home. Well, before you get too excited, all the Christians in the world bought tickets to the same 2-act play. Totally missed the first act. went through the lobby, saw the second act, thought it was great. So you have all the Jews seeing the first act, and you have all the Christians seeing the second act, and the tragedy is that they passed each other in the lobby, and they never saw each other again. And so we're trying to bring a remedy to that. As the things that we do, we are equipping Christians with the roots of their faith so that they can help Jews make better sense out of Jesus. Because you see, when I try to, I've spent, I don't know how many years on the streets of New York, Brooklyn, Manhattan, talking to Jewish people, secular, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. If you try to share with them out of the New Testament, and Matt will talk about that later more, but, that's not their book. They don't want to hear it. So it's a very difficult audience to deal with. But what I believe in is that there is a continuity between Jewish history and salvation history. And it all comes together in the Messiah. So we don't put off the Old Testament and that story. We bring it together, crossing the bridge, and it all meets together. You guys meet with us at the Messiah. We had the law, we had the temple service, we had everything, but we come from the opposite direction, having everything, but it means nothing unless we come to the Messiah. You guys had nothing, and that means nothing until you come to the Messiah, and then we become one new man, right? So that's the short version of who we are.
Yeah, so the Jews are all going to synagogues on Saturday, on Shabbat, right? That's how it happens. So yesterday, starting Friday night, was the Shabbat, ended last night. We have Christians that are going and they're showing up to churches all over the world right now on Sunday morning. And we want to be able to reach right there in the middle and be able to share the entire story of God. Why? Because it's helping Christians in the church make sense of the roots of your faith. We want to be able to help the Jewish people make sense of Jesus, Yeshua, their Messiah. And so we want to bring all of that together. What we say is we have a lot of well-meaning Christians that want to bring the gospel, share the gospel with Jesus' own biological family, the Jewish people. And so when we want to share the gospel, what we've been trained to do is what? We go to John 3:16, or we go to something called the Roman road, right? Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. You go all the way over to the end to Romans 10, right? If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you believe that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. The only problem is if you try to share that story with the Jewish people, the Roman road leads to a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac. You just start spinning there out. Why? Because that's not my book. Show me from my book. Imagine that you're shipwrecked on an island with nothing but Jews, and there's a great deli there. But your New Testament is sunk to the bottom of the sea, and lo and behold, what washes up on the shore is the Old Testament. And all of these Jews are saying, you know the gospel, share it. You have the book. And now we as Christians, what do? I don't know where the gospel is in the Old Testament. And now we have an exposure here that we should know better. So rather than sharing the Roman road, we share the Jewish road. God's plan of salvation through the Old Testament. Passages that look like Leviticus 17, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. Isaiah 59, 1 and 2, that our iniquity has created a separation between us and God. Deuteronomy 18 that talks about there is a greater Moses to come. All the way up until, if you can't remember anything else, just go to Isaiah 53, right? But God has laid out his plan of salvation for the Jewish people. Now, I told you, we might not look Jewish right here, but I have a picture of us at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And when you go there, they'll ask you, are you Jewish? And we say, yes. And they'll say, we're going to lay tefillin on you. They take these leather straps, you shall bind these truths on your arm. And there's a little box. You can see this box on our left arm. When it says in Deuteronomy, it's the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And it goes on, V'ahavta et Elohecha. It says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. You shall take all of these things and you shall put them on your hearts. You shall bind them as frontlets between your eyes. When you're wearing this is our Jewish people are trying to follow the law to the T. Inside those little boxes, they're called phylactery boxes, is the Word of God, is the Old Testament. It's actually the Ten Commandments that are in there. And so this is their expression of actually trying to put the word of God as close as you can to your heart, which is your left arm right there, and put it as frontlets between your eyes. So this is what we do to reach out to our people. But that story goes back generations and generations. There's one other picture we want to show you. This is your great-grandfather, right?
Yeah, my great-grandfather. This is Sholem Kantorovich. In the 1800s, back in Russia, he was the chief rabbi of Grodno, Russia. And, we don't have a lot of information from him. He was my mother's grandmother, my grandmother's father. And what did I say? Did I say grandmother?
Yes.
Yeah.
Your grandmother's father.
My grandmother's father. And so, as I said, he was the chief rabbi in Grodno, Russia. Most of the family was wiped out in the Holocaust. But, as Pastor Leif was sharing here about what the Lord is doing, what he's moving, and how so many people were being healed, his hand is upon this. I don't know what my great-grandfather would have said about this in terms of what happened to my family and to me, but I've got to tell a little bit of the story. We're already going over, right? Over time. Yeah.
Yalla, yalla.
I promised we'd get everybody out of here by 2:30. So. They're laughing. It must be okay. So anyway, when I grew up most of my life, as a kid and into my adulthood, graduated college, everything was fine, life was great. And I grew up with the sense that I understood who I was as a Jew. My mother told me early on in my life concerning Jesus that he's not for you. And then one day, the reason I'm telling this story, one day my wife and I were having dinner at my folks' house, and for dessert we got a different thing. My mom had been really sick, I have to tell you. She had been sick with diverticulitis. She was on medication all the time, and she was in a lot of pain. But in the last couple of weeks, I had seen a little bounce back into her step, and she was smiling and so on. And she said after dinner, your father and I have something to tell you. And I said, what's that? And she says, well, you've heard of Hebrew Christians, right? I said, no, that kind of sounds like an oxymoron. What are you talking about? And she says, well, your father and I have become Hebrew Christians. We believe in Jesus, and his name is Yeshua. I said, what? And so they started telling me the story. They took me through passages in the Bible. She says, can I read something from you? I said, it's got to be my Bible. She says, it's Isaiah. I said, is that in my Bible? And so she read Isaiah 53. She said, who does that sound like? I said, it sounds like Jesus. What's he doing in my Bible? And so, the thing is, though, she came to the Lord because I told you she was very sick. And the whole reason I'm saying all of this is when she was witnessed to, she said, I will have to have a sign before I believe that. And she was healed immediately. Wow. That was it, And that became the catalyst for me to have to sit up and pay attention to what they were saying. And so that, resulted in months of research and trying to prove them wrong and so on and so forth. So anyway, it went from my great-grandfather, wherever he went, to my grandmother and to my parents. Both became believers. And then my grandmother, when she was from Poland, came to the United States when she was a teenager all by herself, and she became a believer when she was 80 years old. So, this whole thing, that sign had an impact. God was working.
And God is still working. And if you look at what's going on in the world today, there's been a shift in our world. You see that all of a sudden this tiny little country the size of Lake Erie or New Jersey is frontline news every single day. There is a movement now stirring in America that is saying we are anti-Jew, we are anti-Israel, we are anti-Zionist, and now everything has changed. Just a few weeks ago, Iran, who's no longer hiding behind any proxies, fired 330 ballistic missiles and drones, came over to Israel and a miracle took place. 99% of those were stopped. No one was killed, which is unbelievable. But we have to look at this, and I want you to understand that God is up to something, and it's something good. He's always been up to something good. But on that night, as all of those rockets are coming, they had hours of warning. Israelis all throughout the land jumped on their computers, jumped on their phones, and they went to Google. Do you know what the number one searched word was that night? A Hebrew word called Tehillim, the Psalms. See, most Jewish people, 70% of the country, they show up to Passover and they show up to High Holy Days, right? They don't really follow every single week. They're largely atheist, largely secular. But when push came to shove, and there's an existential threat coming their way in the form of 330 missiles, they are looking to God for comfort through the Psalms. And we are praying not only that they would look to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but our message and our hope is that they would turn to Yeshua, Jesus, their Messiah, and find ultimate peace. And so we want to tell you a story from Act 1 leading into Act 2 that intersects with our lives and our plan today. My dad's going to start us out, and I'll take us home after that. Here we go.
Okay. We're going to start off. We're going to go back to the book of Genesis, and I want to talk to you about the life of Joseph. I love the life of Joseph. I've taught through him so many times, and I always learn new things, even after I've studied and talked about him. But we're going to go to the end of Joseph's life. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 50, and we're going to pick it up in verse 22. And I think I'll just read through those few verses there. You can follow along. And it says, "So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I'm about to die. But God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob.' Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, 'God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here.' So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." The whole story of Joseph, if you follow it through the book of Genesis, starts in Genesis 37 and goes through just all of the chaos and everything of Joseph's life. And now, this young man who was 17 years old, and he was sent by his father Jacob to check on his brothers at a little place up north, a couple of days away from where they were, in a place called Shechem. And that's where he was sent to check on his brothers. And now we find he's 110 years old, and he has lived long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren. And with his great-great-grandchildren able to see him and know him, and then to pass the knowledge of who he was onto their children and onto their children's children, we have a period of about 100 years where after the death of Joseph, you have people who are alive who can still speak with clarity about who he was and the story of his life to generations for the next 100 years. And the future generations asked about, as they asked about the coffin in Egypt, and that phrase is there, a coffin in Egypt, is there as a final statement in the book of Genesis. It's interesting that the book of Genesis, it starts with life and it ends with death. It starts with, in the beginning, God created all of God's creation, animals, sun, moon, stars, light, dark, everything. It starts with life and it ends with death. And it's Yet, even though it ends with death, that's not the end of the story. A coffin in Egypt. Because that coffin in Egypt points us to the continuing existence of God compared to this temporary, brief, transient life of man. And so that coffin in Egypt pointed to the future, and it's going to point future generations forward, allowing them to understand that the coffin was being kept there for a purpose. Just as we read, Joseph made his brothers swear to carry his bones back to the promised land, and that coffin was an object lesson pointing future generations to a future event that was going to take place. And so we come to another phase after the death of Joseph, and it's interesting because I call them the silent years. And when we look at verse 22, there's that little phrase that says, Joseph stayed in Egypt, okay? And that's all it says. But we have to realize, we can just drive by that and go on with the next verse and the rest of it, but you have to realize it says Joseph stayed in Egypt. That covered a period of 54 years in the life of Joseph, of which we know nothing about. The scripture is silent on it. The last event that occurred was in chapter 49, the last verse, with the death. It was the death of his father, Jacob. And then we fast forward to verse 22 in chapter 50, and Joseph stayed in Egypt. And those were what I refer to as the silent years, compared to all of the drama and everything of the life of Joseph, everything that he went through, being sold by his brothers into slavery, being in Potiphar's house, being accused by Potiphar's wife, being thrown in prison, out of the prison, then back into the dungeon until Pharaoh has a dream. So all of that unpredictable upheaval in the life of Joseph, that the scriptures really, they shine a spotlight on that. Compared, to all of that, these past 54 years, the second half of his life, while not unworthy of consideration, they're actually given no consideration at all in the scriptures. And so we might say that these years were pretty much humdrum, routine, everyday life. The kids are growing up, the grandkids are growing up, all of this is taking place. And compared to everything that happened to Joseph as a young man, his later years must have really kind of been pretty dull and, pretty routine. But for Joseph, in his life experience, his life was driven by a purpose. So that even in those routine years, those humdrum years, as the family grew, Joseph never allowed his heart to become fully at home in Egypt. And there's a lesson for us there. Joseph kept his focus on something that was actually more important than an easy lifestyle, a great retirement, having a boat that you can go out with, having all of the comforts and everything of that lifestyle. Joseph kept his focus on something that was more important than an easy life. And he wasn't, I would say he wasn't preoccupied with this life. He never really made Egypt his home. It wasn't like one of those things like your best life now. If this is your best life now, you're in big trouble. Okay? So it's not about the here and now, it's about the then and there. And this is where Joseph's focus was. Now, why do I bring that up? Because in this short little passage, we find that Joseph's thoughts extend way beyond Egypt. His responsibility, as he sees it, is to make sure that his children and his children's children don't get too comfortable in Egypt. He wanted to make sure that they didn't settle down in Egypt. Rather, he wanted them to stay unsettled. He wanted them to stay unsettled enough so that one day they might be ready to move when the word came it was time to move. So just like it's our job, I think, to make sure that our kids and our grandkids don't get too settled in America. And I would say that for 250 years, America was a haven for the Jewish people. And it's been a great country for everybody. But things can go south really fast, can't they? We're seeing it. And guess who's right at the head of all of that stuff going south? You know, you have an enemy focused on Israel. And it's not just focused on Israel, because while they're chanting death to the Jews, they're chanting death to America. And so we don't want our kids, while while we enjoy the comforts of America that we have lived in, and my family has lived in it since the turn of the last century, we don't want to become anchored as if there is nothing else out there. So that coffin in Egypt for them, suddenly in their life and in the things that they went through, took on something of a great significance. And while they had a coffin in Egypt with a physical body in it, we have something that kind of gives us a warning, the same thing. We have an empty tomb, right? No body in it, no physical body in it. And so the problem is, for Joseph and for Egypt and for his family, is that these kids, just like we did here in America, grew up knowing only life in Egypt, you know? And when you talk about God is going to visit you and he's going to take you out of this place, what do you mean he's going to take us out of this place? We live in Egypt. You know, I went to school in Egypt. I met my girlfriend here. We got married here. We had our kids here. Everything is about life here. Life is good, right? And, you know, what are you talking about Canaan? You know, you got to be kidding. So, you see, Joseph's responsibility over the course of time was to make sure that the root structure didn't go down very deep there. And we can do the same thing here. We got to make sure, because God has plans, and he has plans that he's going to bring us someplace else. Just as we see in Joseph's last words, in verse 24, this was actually the theme of his life. He says, God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land. And in verse 25, it says, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. God is going to bring us back. And that's his message to the generations that are going to follow. And when you consider Joseph's life and all of the havoc and chaos and everything that he went through and all the story that he went through, you know, you would think that when it came to the writer of Hebrews, who would have so much to write about, this is what the writer to the Hebrews wrote about in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 22. He said, it says, by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. That seems to me to be like, wow, with everything that happened to him, he's talking about bones, you know? And it wasn't that he had some kind of a preoccupation with bones or anything like that. I'm sure that Joseph had no idea that his people were going to spend 430 years as slaves in Egypt. I don't think that entered his mind. And then an entire generation, after they come out of Egypt, are going to wander around the desert for 40 years until God actually lets a generation into the promised land. They wandered around for 40 years because of unbelief. You know, it's interesting. There's a parallel, because when the Messiah came, when Jesus came, the religious leaders led most of the people away. There was a small remnant of Jewish people who believed in the Messiah at the first coming of Jesus. But, you know, not all of them believed. Many of them didn't believe. And so the offer of the kingdom that Jesus came to give to Israel to establish the kingdom, that offer was rescinded. You can see where that happened in Matthew chapter 12, where they committed the unpardonable sin. And so the offer of the kingdom was rescinded, but you know what? That offer of the kingdom is going to be reoffered. It's going to be reoffered to another Jewish generation, just like happened in the wilderness, another Jewish generation that this time is going to come out of the Great Tribulation, and he will come back and he will establish the kingdom at that time. The prophets even made mention of this. They made mention of it several times. One of them I'll share with you, excuse me, is in the book of Hosea. Hosea chapter 5, one verse, verse 15, I want to share with you. And this is God speaking. You got to remember, God is speaking here. And he says, I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt. Okay? So God is speaking, and he says, I will return to my place. Now, in order for God to return to his place, he has to what? He has to first leave his place, right? When did God ever leave his place? Hello? Yeah, when the Messiah came, when Jesus came, he left his place. And he says, I'll return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt. And he's not talking about Israel confessing all of their sins. That word guilt is the Hebrew word avon. It is singular and it is specific. It's one transgression, one iniquity that not only Hosea talks about, but several of the other prophets talk about. That one iniquity that they must confess is their rejection of the Messiah. And when they do that, at the end of the tribulation period, they will look unto him whom they have pierced, it says, Zechariah says, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will turn to the Messiah, and he will return then and set up the kingdom to that Jewish generation. And by the way, there will be tons of people out there who are not Jewish who will be a part of that as, the kingdom is established and set up. The point is, there's no replacement theology here. God made a covenant with Abraham, and he made a promise to him about the land and the seed. And he said, this is going to be a perpetual covenant with him. And if you want to get rid of the Jews, what you need to do, Jeremiah told us in Jeremiah chapter 31, he said, you go and you eliminate the sun and the moon and the stars and all of the host of heaven. And when you do that, I will forsake Israel for all that they have done. It's the same thing as saying, that's forever. And if that's forever, my covenant is forever. They're firing rockets at the wrong place. They should be firing them up there. So, it's interesting that as we look at that, I think Joseph experienced birth pangs in terms of the things that he knew what was coming, but he didn't know exactly what was coming. Jesus gave us indications of the fact that toward the end of the age, we are going to experience birth pangs. And we look at the circumstances that we're living in today, and we say, wow, these are definitely birth pangs. They're talking about wars and rumors of wars all over the place, But I'm going to suggest to you that those birth pangs started over 100 years ago. They started with World War I. And then that was the war to end all wars, right? And then came World War II 20 years later. But World War I was significant in terms of these birth pangs because I believe that World War I prepared the land for the people. You had the British Mandate. You had the partitioning of the land. They prepared the land for the people. World War II prepared the people for the land. And what is everybody talking about today? The great fear is that, something is going to touch off World War III. And whether that is a separate thing by itself or whether that is something that's incorporated into the tribulation, I don't know yet. I'm not sure. But that is, I believe, when that happens, is going to prepare the people for their Messiah. So that is our message, is this place is not home. The Lord is coming, and he's going to bring us to that place. So just as Joseph, he said the same thing to his family, don't make Egypt your home. because you're going somewhere else. He believed in the promises of the Abrahamic covenant, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones out of here. Well, the story, it seems like the story ends in verse 26 of chapter 50. We have the record of Joseph's death, and so Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So, as I said, the book opens with life, and it ends with death. Starts with in the beginning, and it ends with a coffin in Egypt. Jacob is dead, Joseph is dead, and the end of that book of Genesis sets the stage for the book of Exodus, which is going to carry the story of Israel forward. It's the book of redemption, and Matt's going to share with you what happens after this, taking us into where we are.
Yeah, so the story is not complete, right? This is not the story of, hey, it begins in the beginning. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God. He creates something. We have life. It's not like we get to the end of Genesis and Joseph dies. Joseph did great things. Whole family's around him. And they say, oh, Grandpa was a good man. And then we just kind of put a period on the end of that story, and it's all done. Because they're not where they're supposed to be. We can't just say, this is the end of the story, and all is well, and this is a beautiful ending. Israel is not where they're supposed to be, but life is good. Life is real good, right? They've got their 5-acre parcel right there on the Nile. And they're thinking, this is great. They're in Goshen. Do you know Goshen? Do you know the MyPillow guy, Mike? Have you seen the commercials? He's saying, like, we get our cotton. It's Egyptian spun cotton. It's from Goshen. It's that Nile Delta area. When we look at what's going on here in the United States, and we have some really amazing fertile land, they say that flyover country where we're growing everything, they say that we have 1 foot deep of topsoil. And that's why things grow so well. They've actually had geologists and agricultural folks that have looked at this, and they say in Goshen, right there in the Nile Delta, the topsoil goes not 1 foot, not 2 feet, but 70 feet deep. You can grow anything there. It's beautiful and it's amazing. So life is good in Egypt. They can't imagine, why would we want God to take us and visit us and get us out? And I'm guilty of this. I look at my life right now, and I think to myself, not yet, God. my kids are just growing up. I want to see them married. Not yet, God. My 401k is getting to the point where I've worked my entire life, and now I'm almost ready to retire. Things are just starting to crystallize. I like it here. God, not yet. And then there's this other part of me that says, Lord, take me, get me out of this place. And the call for the Israelites living in Egypt in this time is keep the boat in the water, but don't keep the water in the boat. God is going to raise you up. He's going to get you out. There will be a visit. And so what does that visit look like? We read that, and all we have to do is just flip one page. If you go from Genesis chapter 50, in my Bible, it's one page. Genesis 50, and you just move over to Exodus chapter 1. And that transition right there is 430 years. 430 years of waiting for a deliverer, for the visit of God to come. And what does it say? Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Somebody said, hey, king in Egypt, do you know Joseph? He'd say, no. You know the box of bones that's over here, that coffin of bones? It says Joseph on it. Oh, yeah, that guy. Those Israelites, they think they're getting out. That's not happening on my watch. He said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they might join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities of Pithom and Ramses, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. to the point where the exodus out of Egypt, they say there were 600,000 men, likely about 2 million Israelites eventually make their way out. But that land of Goshen, the beauty of life in Egypt, where 430 years before they may have said, why would I ever leave this place? 430 years later, they're saying, get me out. And you read, if you just flip the page again in Exodus chapter 2, you see that Pharaoh has enacted all of his rules and life has become bitter. My dad and I, over the last 2 months, we've been all over the country leading Passover Seders. And this is the meal that Jesus and his disciples, they remembered this meal. They remembered the Exodus coming up and out of Egypt. But on the middle of the table for a Passover Seder, we have something called a Seder plate. And I call it a plate of suffering. We have horseradish on there, and we tell you to eat enough to where you cry. And it reminds us of the tears. We take parsley and we dip it in salt water. It's not very appetizing, any of it, right? We dip it in salt water to remind us of the tears. We eat this sweet apple mixture. It's called haroset, to remind us of the mortar that the Jewish people had to make mortar without straw in Exodus chapter 5. But listen to this in Exodus 2. During those many days, the king of Egypt died. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. And they cried out for help, and their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. Have you ever needed a cry for help and you raise it up to God? We have evidence here that he hears. It says, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with who? Papa Abraham. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, that he also repeated with Isaac, and he repeated again with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And that's a 4-point message if I've ever heard it, right? God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew. That same God who heard his people in suffering, I just want you to know, whatever your suffering is, you can cry out to him, and he will hear you. And he knows. And he says, I will deliver you in this life or the next. But I don't like open story loops. So whatever became of the bones of Joseph? Did the generations to follow remember the words of Joseph? Let me give you a snapshot. It's in Exodus chapter 13. What I'm skipping over is we've just gone through 10 plagues. And in those 10 plagues, we have that final plague. We go through all of those. We have the death of the firstborn. And finally, Pharaoh has had it, and he says, get out of here. And in Exodus 13, it says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, it was closer. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war, they might go back to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went up and out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. But listen to this. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. If you've ever watched the Veggie Tales, that you can do on Right Now Media, by the way. It's like Christian Netflix. It's awesome. We don't often see that picture, right? What we see in the parting of the Red Sea is Moses with his outstretched arms, and the people are walking through the walls of water. But Moses is also yelling out saying, did somebody get Joseph? Go back. And there's a guy who was appointed for generations, right? Like, I got it. All right, good, right? So we're taking all of the cattle, all of the people, all the gold. They're out there, they're walking through the Red Sea, and there's somebody or some people, I don't know how big it is, but they're carrying the bones of Joseph. Faithfully, they did it. And then what happens? For 40 years, they're wandering the wilderness, and they're thinking to themselves, you took us out of Egypt for this? They went from orientation to disorientation. It's the wilderness season. And when we're in that disorientation season, St. John of the Cross, he calls it the wilderness, the dark night of the soul. Has anyone ever been there? I'm a frequent traveler. I've got that ID card, no problem. So it's in the wilderness that God forges a relationship with his people. It's in the wilderness that God says, we're going to get to know each other here. And as they wander and as they're carrying the bones of Joseph, I mean, just reread the Torah, reread the Exodus, and go into Leviticus and Numbers. But by year 2, they come within 11 miles of the promised land. They send the spies in. They get this report, and they said, no, there's giants there. It's really scary. We don't want to do it. And God says, because of your lack of faith, I'm just going to reroute you. And for the next 38 years, they are wandering the wilderness. But reread it and remember, they're carrying the bones of Joseph. When we find ourselves in the wilderness, what do we want? If the promised land seems too far away, we say, just take me back to Egypt. Isn't it unbelievable how many times they say, if only we could go back to Egypt, we could have leeks. Do you know what leeks are? It's like onions. I hate onions. I would never go back. You may call it home, but it's a prison over there. Isn't it amazing that when we get into that season of disorientation, we just want out? But doesn't it sometimes seem that the promised land is too far away? God says, no, I have you here for a reason. Walter Brueggemann, he wrote a book called The Spirituality of the Psalms, where he talks about, he says, the Psalms are a metaphor for life, and we have these movements from orientation to disorientation to, we're not going back to reorientation. It's a new normal. I'm doing something with you in this season. What is promised in the covenant is not equilibrium, but faithfulness. That our walks are not a steady upward growth and movement to the right, but it consists of painful wrenchings and surprising gifts along the way. And over none of these do we preside. We don't have control over that. I want you to understand that while they're in the wilderness, that God is up to something. Just listen to this. This is great. You know the word love. You've heard the word love has multiple meanings as you look at it in the Greek in the New Testament, right? You've heard of agape love. We've heard of eros love, the romantic love, right? We've heard of phileo, the brotherly love. I want to give you another word, but it's in Act 1. Can you go there with me for a second? The word wilderness has 3 different words in the Hebrew. The first one is midbar. Would you say midbar? Midbar is the most common use of the word wilderness. It shows up 271 times in the Old Testament. Midbar is a wilderness that you can survive in. The midbar, you can find a little watering hole. The midbar, you might be able to find some vegetation, some grass for your sheep. But there's another kind of wilderness. I'm all good with the midbar, but you don't want to be in the Tzia. Say Tzia. Tzia shows up 16 times in the Old Testament. Now, Tzia, you can't survive unless you become dependent on hospitality. You hope to run in, as you're going through the Tzia, you hope that you might find some Bedouins in the middle of this wilderness. And if you find them, they're going to take care of you, and they will feed you, they will feed your animals, so that you can get to the next place okay. But there's a third kind of wilderness, and it's called the Yeshimon. Say Yeshimon. Yeshimon is scorched earth. Nobody survives the Yeshimon. It shows up 13 times in the Old Testament. And as theologians and archaeologists are looking at the path that Israel took as they wandered through the wilderness, they realize that for 35 out of the 40 years that Israel is in the wilderness, they are in the Yeshimon. How do you take 2 million people through the Yeshimon, which nobody can survive, and they don't just survive, but they thrive? It's because of the hospitality of God. Their sandals did not wear out. Manna continued to flow. In fact, I just read this morning, Joshua 5, the very last time. They celebrated Passover on the 14th of the month of Nisan, and then they ate the bread, the grain of the land, and the produce of the land, and then the manna stopped, and God continued to provide through the land. But all through that time, I mean, you go from Exodus 12 all the way up to Joshua chapter 5, God provided. It was the hospitality of God. When we take people to Israel, we've been there almost 30 times. We go through and we take people into the wilderness, into the Yeshimon. It's the wilderness of Zin, and I tell them the exact same message that I just told you. I tell them about the 3 kinds of wilderness. We go 20 minutes out for a little hike out in the wilderness. We talk about this story. We look around, and there is nothing. It's desolate still. And I say, all right, great message. Everybody back to the bus. But really, the message has just begun. Because when we get back to the parking lot to meet the bus is not there. It's all a big setup. We've got it. Now, by the way, if you come, you got to keep your mouth shut. Don't tell anybody else about what I'm about to tell you. We get to the bus. I look at my Israeli tour guide. We've done this before. And I say, where's the bus? He says, I don't know. And he starts getting on the phone, and he's speaking Hebrew 1,000,000 miles an hour, talking to the bus driver. Where'd you go? He comes back to me. We're whispering back to me. And I go, friends, I'm sorry. We got our lines crossed. The bus is actually at another location. We're just going to go for a quick walk, and we're going to go meet the bus. Everyone's like, oh, okay, here we go. 20-minute walk, and we get to the place that the bus is supposed to meet us, and the bus is not there. And at this point, like the people wanted to kill Moses, they want to kill me. I look at the tour guide gets back on the phone with the bus driver. I don't even think he dials the bus driver anymore, and they're yelling back and forth in Hebrew, and he comes back to me, and I come back up to the people and say, friends, we've really messed this up. We're having some major communication problems. You're all, wow, this sounds like a really great tour. I should totally sign up, right? So friends, we have to walk. It's just over here. We take them for 20 more minutes of a walk, and I stop right in front of this huge sand dune. And I stop, and the people at this point are ready to send me to Egypt. I said, I want to apologize, but we need to talk about something. I said, we have been walking for 40 minutes trying to find the promised land of an air-conditioned bus with bathrooms and water. Can you imagine doing this for 40 years? And all of a sudden, they got it. I said, on the other side of this berm, this sand dune, is a Bedouin village. They couldn't see it from that point. Isn't that always the case, that we can't see what's on the other side? I love Isaiah 40. It says, it is he who sits above the vault or the circle of this earth, and we, the inhabitants, are like grasshoppers. That God sees it all from the beginning to the end, and we just keep hitting into these walls. Say, do you see me? Do you hear my groaning? Don't you know what I'm going through? And God says, I see, I hear, I know, I remember. So on the other side of this sand dune is a Bedouin village. It still exists today. I said, we are going to go here, and we're going to experience the wilderness hospitality. And we go over, they come over, they start running. They couldn't walk another step 5 minutes ago, but they start running down that sand dune. We have sweet tea offered by the most generous Middle Eastern Bedouins that you ever met. And 5 minutes later, they're on camels. They're riding camels. That's what Americans love to do. And they're saying, this is the greatest trip I've ever taken in my life. And they want to enthrone me king, right, at that moment. It's fantastic. It's good to be in Israel. What's interesting is, as the writer of the Torah gives us this message, is that as Israel is wandering through the Yeshimon, it's not ever really described as the Yeshimon, because with God can take Yeshimons of our life and make them midbars. See what I'm saying? How many of you have experienced in the last 5 years the Yeshimon season? This church was started at the beginning of a Yeshimon season for the world. And we're here. Some of you have still been suffering, but some of you have been thriving. I want you to realize that God is going to deliver. God is faithful. Let me wrap this story, because guess what? We're not done with the bones of Joseph. Do you know that it shows up one last time? Really? Yeah. Look, they get through 40 years of wandering. They've been schlepping Joseph. It's a Yiddish word. It means everything's suffering, right? Like the Jewish people, we have to suffer, because if we didn't have suffering, then we wouldn't have complaining. And that's the only thing that we like more than anything else is we love to complain. Don't take away our suffering, because we have to complain. They go through the wilderness. They come into Canaan. They're defeating all of the armies, the peoples, the nations that are coming against them. And they finally get to the end in Joshua chapter 24. And this is the passage where Joshua stands before the people and says, choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And they go all the way up to the end of Joshua. And you see this passage. Can we get that up there? As for the bones of Joseph, oh yeah, whatever happened to that? For the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. And for those of you who need closure, for those of you who need those open story loops to close, we finally get to lay to rest the bones of Joseph. God is faithful to his word. It's interesting to me that Joseph says, God will surely visit you. He will take you up and out of here. And what followed was 430 years of waiting. God sends a deliverer in the person of Moses. And Moses frees the Israelites from bondage and slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt. Fast forward that story, and you have the prophets of Israel, even the kings of Israel, that are saying, there is another prophet who is coming. There is another deliverer who's coming. Keep watch. And if you just turn one page from Malachi to Matthew, you have another 400 years of waiting. And we are waiting for that deliverer, and the deliverer comes, and his name is Yeshua, Jesus. And he comes not to deliver his people from the bondage of Egypt and Pharaoh, but from the bondage of sin and death. And as he leaves, he says, I am coming again, and I will deliver you again. And unfortunately, it has not been another 400 years. It has been 2,000 years of waiting. But if he was faithful on these other ones, then we better stand sure today that he will be faithful again. That the deliverer is coming. And I want you to hear that you are at a phenomenal church. You are in a small minority of churches. 75% of the churches here in America don't want to have anything to do with the Jewish people, which is amazing, right? This is the story of the Jewish people. You read Romans chapter 11, is God done with Israel? What does Paul say? May it never be, God forbid. 25% of the churches are still believing today that God is going to be faithful to his covenant. Your pastors here, this team here, stands with the Jewish people and stands with Israel. There is no replacement theology in this place. And this is what the Jewish people need in this day, because we are living in a world where we've just flipped the page. And I'm telling you that this anti-Semitism that we are seeing in the world right now, it is not a gradual, like, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, we're at a 3 and we'll know when we hit a 4. It's not a slippery slope, it's a sheer cliff. So we need people who will stand with us. Most of the pastors that we talk to, I see two things. One is indifference, and the other is ignorance. They look right past us. And so when you said that we're kindred spirits, there's a Hebrew word, it's kashar. It means knitted together. It's what David and Jonathan had. And I've been just, the verse, Proverbs 17:17 has been staying with me this week, is that a friend loves at all times, but a brother is born in adversity. And we feel a kinship and a connection to you guys. As we say in now Kentucky, to y'all. No, you say that here? We say shalom y'all, right? Shalom y'all. My dad has it. In fact, you have another hat that says chai y'all, and chai means to life. We have all of the hats, all of the shirts. It's fantastic. Now, I know you guys do homework here, and I'm going to give you an assignment, and I want to encourage you to do this. I want everybody to take your fists, your hands, and I want you to make them into fists. If God has set us here on this earth and he said, I have something greater, I'm going to come and I'm going to deliver you, and you're saying, I like it here, I'm holding on to things, I want you to just at some point this week, and you can do it more than once, it's okay to do extra homework, you get extra credit, right? What is it that I'm holding on to? Say, God, I want to see my kids married. God, I've almost paid the car off or my student loans off. God, I'm holding on to these things. What is God asking you to let go of? What are you holding on to that this earth has to offer that has nothing in comparison to what he wants to give us? And then it's interesting, if you look at this is the symbol these days for resistance. Did you know that? Like put your fist up, the closed fist, the clenched fist, this is the sign for resistance in our day. To what extent am I resisting God's plan for my life? I want you to take those clenched fists and I want you to open them. What just happened for me was blood started returning to my fingers. Life is moving again. And I'm going to open up. I'm going to surrender what I'm trying to hold on to, and I'm going to open up to what God wants me to. God, what is it? Pray that prayer. Lean into that prayer this week and say, God, what is it that you want me to open myself up to? And not just that I'm going to open myself up, but I'm going to now surrender my plans for your plans. I want to close with this. Pastor Leif, would you come up? Just beyond our hands, I want us to link arms. We feel like we have linked arms with you. We thank you for your generosity and your hospitality to us in bringing us here. But if a brother is born for adversity, these are the times we're living in times of adversity. And this is where we need brothers and sisters in the Lord to be able to stand. If we don't flex these muscles now, I'm telling you, it's not going to get any easier. The sins of our fathers is we remain silent when we should have said something. And so we know that in this place that we have friends here in Anna, Texas, of all places. It's amazing. So I want to bless you as you have blessed us. Would you stand up and would you just receive a blessing? This is an old blessing. And Aaron prayed this over the people. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Ya'er Adonai panavlecha v'chunecha. Yisa Adonai panavlecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may the Lord lift up the light of his countenance to you, and may he give you shalom. Lord, thank you for new friends and new family, that our hearts would be kashar, knitted together. Lord, that we would stand up for this generation, in this generation, for this time, and believe that this place is not our home, that you are calling us to your kingdom. May that be the cry of our hearts every single day. And all God's people said, amen. Shalom.
I don't know about y'all, but I'm kind of fired up this morning. That was a precious word from a kindred spirit, a heart. And listen, when I say kindred spirit, I mean that with the highest possible honor. I'm ascribing to myself that I might be a kindred spirit with just somebody who's become a dear friend. You've heard from Matt Davis before. You just might not have realized you heard from Matt Davis before. I love having the opportunity to bring somebody that I'm learning from and bring them to y'all, because I want y'all to learn everything I'm learning. I don't want to keep anything back for myself. I want to share it with y'all. As a family of believers, we have to understand that this is not the Jewish story, and then there's the Christian story that's separate, but rather we're one family. There's one family. And just like we stand with them, if we think for any moment of time that, well, that's the attack against the Jewish people, that's the attack against Israel, listen, the same attack will come for us too. It's already becoming less and less comfortable, and yet we're still stuck in that place where, you know what, why would I want to leave Egypt? It's nice here, it's comfortable here. Well, that's because the king who had not known Joseph had not arrived yet, but then here's the king who had not known Joseph, and things began to change. Well, if we're not aware, things have begun to change. And listen, that's not anything to make you nervous or scared, because, you know, it was John 16:33, Jesus said, in this world, not you might have trouble. In this world, you have trouble as long as, you know, if you don't act just right, then no, in this world, you will have trouble. But don't be afraid, because I've already overcome the world. We don't have to live in fear. We just need to understand the times and season we're living in. So we never want to be just what can God do for me today, church, but I need to understand that we are a part of his story and stop trying to figure out how God can make my story better. Yes, your story will be infinitely better when we walk with God. And yet, it's not about my story. It's about what God is doing in the earth. And what he's doing in the earth is not Act 1 and it's not Act 2 alone. It's both together. So we are both together. And we'll walk in partnership with this since March has become our outreach. Paul said in Romans, the Jew first and the Gentile. What does that mean? That we are to love our Jewish brothers and love them enough to proactively share the gospel in whatever way we can. Well, you know what? I went to Israel a year and now 3 months ago, a year and 2 months ago, and I was only there for 10 days, and it was the first time I've ever been, and yet I'm homesick because I love that place. Having been there, and I was on the Sea of Galilee, and I was in Migdal at the synagogue, the Second Temple era synagogue where Jesus taught, and I've been to these places, and now my heart is knit, and I already loved Israel before, but as much as I thought I loved Israel now that I've been, listen, you connect on a whole another level. And so we're going to take a trip to Israel at some point, and we're going to ask Matt to be our tour guide. We will begin to announce and prepare as soon as we know. Listen, it's not cheap. I can't make it free. So we're going to have to all plan in advance and make plans to go. But listen, I'm telling you that there's something precious and wonderful about being in the place. Being on the Temple Mount at the place where we know Jesus spoke from right here. There's something precious about that. I want to say that when we were there, we were treated so graciously and so lovingly by everyone we encountered. And we want to believe and in Jesus' name receive that we want to be the same back. And then more so because we have something to offer. We have love to offer. So we don't ever want to be guilty of just, God, what can you do to make my life easier? But rather we understand that for such a time as this. Y'all know my very favorite author, one of my very favorite quotes. Christianity, if false, C.S. Lewis said, is of no importance. If true, is of ultimate importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. So let us never be guilty of living lives that ascribe moderate importance to our faith. This is our faith. And this is not our home. Egypt was not the home of the Israelites, and not even Anna, Texas. This is not our eternal home. We have a heavenly home. This is our final allegiance. And while we're here in this place, it's been comfortable, it's wonderful. We understand that it's not about my comfort. It's about what can I do to proclaim the goodness of our God. So I love the homework, the clenched fist. What am I holding on to? That was never truly mine to begin with. That I can say, God, what do you want to do with this? And finally, God, your will, not mine. As we say around here a lot, more of him and less of me. More of him and less of me. Let this be our reality. So don't just, that was a nice little thought with the whole clenched fist thing. No, go home and I want you to literally sit with your family and ask the question, what am I holding on to as if it were mine that I need to release into God's hand? And by the way, when it's your kids, you're not saying, I let go of them. No. God, they were always yours. What do you want to do with this? And finally, we surrender his will, not our will. Don't just say, well, that's a nice thought. I want you to go home. I want you to sit with your family. I want you to clench your fists. And when you clench your fist, don't just say, well, okay. No, clench your fist. I love, because you know what, when he said, when I open my hands, I'm feeling the life return, I was clenching, I didn't even know I was clenching my fist, but I was clenching my fists. And he said, now open them, I'm like, ooh, that feels nice. The freedom and the peace you get when you just turn things over to God, this was always his anyway. God, I trust you in this. I trust you in this. I'm so grateful for our friends. This will be not the last time. This will be one of many times you hear from my friend. And we're going to get a chance to go with him. He goes to Israel on a regular basis, and he's promised to take us with him at some point. So I'm holding him to that. He might have been saying that just to be nice, but I'm holding him to it. So that's happening. Listen, he already did the bless out. He did the part that I just love to do, that we do every single week. Let's just jump to the part where we say this part together. I am the temple of the living God. He goes everywhere I go, and I'm filled with his spirit. God lives in me, and I radiate his presence and love. I have a covenant of peace with him that will not be moved. I walk in peace, and I bring peace to others. In the name of Jesus, God bless you. We love you, and we'll see you next week.